time between failures plus time to repair. You get 100% availability, if either it never fails or recovery is instantaneous. You get one either way, and they've decided to go the other way. That's a risk management decision, I assure you, because they've looked at it exactly like that. Now, trend analysis is what drives those kinds of decisions, because lots of times you can't be sure that, say, a simulation is telling the truth. But if you calculate in a way where you understand how the calculation goes and you have enough consistency that day to day we at least did it the same ways we did yesterday. So if our error was whatever it was yesterday, we have the same error today, so the delta is meaningful. You actually get somewhere. I guess I've beaten that into the ground, but that's what I'm about to do, is take that and then beat some other sticks into the ground. It is the first step in thinking about the future. Now, I will point out something. If you think about the future, if you make early decisions, you of course have much greater options about what you can do. The things you can do if you decide to act early are much broader. Of course, that also means that your confusion about which one to take is much broader. And your ability to justify it to someone who is a deep skeptic or an opponent is worse. On the other hand, if you wait till later, where it's obvious what to do, you don't have as many options. So in a sense, doing this kind of prediction activity is a way of thinking about, am I going to trade one kind of risk, if you want to think of it that way, for another kind of risk? And the trade I'm making is between, I've got a million possibilities, ain't that wonderful, but I can't tell them apart, versus there's only one thing left to do and we're hosed. And it's in between that you want to live. You want to live between those two. And so that's what I'm going to try to do here a little bit. And I'm not actually going to try to predict the 40-year future or something. And I realize that if you do that, it's like being a cosmologist. Nobody can argue with you because there's no way to argue with you, right? I'm actually going to do it up a little closer, so maybe you'll argue with me because that's what I like to do. So here we go. This is William Gibson, the science fiction writer, writing in, of all things, The Economist. The future is already here. It's unevenly distributed. That is, in fact, the case. It's always already here. Just some have it more than others. The idea that he would be writing this in, of all things, The Economist is amazing, but there you go. So here we go. What kind of data is available? What can we look at? What is typically something that we can measure? And really, there's primarily, when you're trying to predict the future, there's primarily two sources. One is you can get lots of event reports and try to do something with a stream of event reports, which is really what I'm going to mostly talk about here. And the other is you can do survey research. By the way, I was asked earlier, was I willing to give these slides over? And of course, I'm always willing to give these slides over. So for what it's worth, somebody somehow will make these available, and they do have margin notes, just for what it's worth. You can do survey research. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to do survey research. It's actually harder than it sounds like, because amongst other things, and this is back to questions of ontology, for example, you say, you ask a question, and really then what happens is the answer you got to the question you thought you were asking or to something else. A typical example from the medical world, you ask if someone has pain, and the people who have more pain are more likely to say yes and quicker than the people who don't, and the people who are stoics won't answer at all. And pretty soon, if you're really serious about this, you have to say, what was I asking? And what were the results here? How do I look at this? You ask, there's lots of problems in doing survey research. And of course, the worst ones are ones where you say, does anybody have an opinion about this? Because all you get are extremes. And if it isn't obvious, every news agency has failed to learn that lesson really well. They ask people on the street, do you have an opinion about this? And the don't bother me's dominate, and yet that's the centroid of public opinion, is the don't bother me, I'm late for work. We'll get to that in a second too. So let's look at a few of these things. There's lots of categories of risk and information security problems that we might talk about. Earlier today, there was some discussion about, was the threat of unauthorized use greater than the threat of, break-ins and what have you. Well, let me just take the CSI FBI study, which I like to make fun of to a degree, but not really. This is, in the last year, have you had an episode in your firm of unauthorized use? Now, mind you, this is a binary decision, so it isn't corrected for, I have 1 employee, I have 1,000 employees, I have 1 million employees. It isn't corrected for that. It's firm-wide. So if you were doing analysis on this, you'd have to remember some things like that. This is, have you had one in the last year? Yes, no, don't know. Now, by the way, if you're ever doing survey research, always say yes, no, don't understand, skip it. And then you've got an answer for everybody, as opposed to forcing people to answer something or just not write it. Or, yeah, I'll skip it, none of the above. Yeah, fair enough, whoever said that. Oh, yeah, you do this all the time, right. The voice of semantic in the audience. Now, this is, of course, it's a little horrifying to imagine that this percentage of people would say, don't know, but nevertheless, this is the picture. Now, you might say, does that tell me anything? Well, let's play with it just a little bit. This is the optimistic version. If you don't know whether you've had an attack, you haven't had one. You add the know and the unknowns together. That's one, if you will, bracket in one direction. The other bracket in the other direction is, of course, if you don't know, you probably have. That, do I believe the yeses or do I believe the nos? This is one way to look at it. And that's perfectly fine because it allows me to say, I might think about this. If I have an optimistic view or a pessimistic view, what band is bracketed by this information? And that's what you see up here. I don't read slides to people, but you can see, we could, if we're pessimistic, it's worse at the outset, but we do better at the end, and vice versa. As you all know, the student who's getting all A's can never get the Most Improved Student Award. It's the same sort of thing here. If you take a pessimistic view, you can often show better improvement. Needless to say, I'll pick on the federal government here. Agencies that have gotten bad FSMA scores like to show that they've made improvement. Actually, having a bad FSMA score at the outset is not a terrible thing because it gives you so much more room for regular improvement year over year. Gene's nodding his head. Yes, this is exactly the case. This is one way to look at this. So when you're playing around with trends, this is one thing you might do. Now, this is the CSI FBI study, and all I would say is they claim that unauthorized use is falling very slowly. I think that's a problem, honestly, of self-selection in the survey. One of the things, if you read their comments that go with this, and of course, interpretation of data is always harder than collection, and collection's hard enough. But one of the things they say is that they've been getting fewer and fewer respondents. Now, that could easily be people who are not responding did have an episode and won't tell. Or people who used to respond and didn't mind saying yes or no now mind, and so the only time they would say no is when it's no, and the only time they say yes is when you don't get an answer back. So, it's a little hard to say what this is, but just for what it's worth, all self-selecting surveys are suspect. So when you read data that is a self-selecting survey, be suspect. But at the least, these folks have collected the same data year after year. They may quit one of these days, and I'll come to that question about quitting in a moment. Incidents. I'm going to keep using their data for a second, and we'll use other people's data in a moment. This is how many people had a security incident where the source was inside versus outside. I found it remarkable that they were getting such collinearity of these numbers. I found that remarkable. The N is 453 here, which is not particularly large when you consider the number of people who could be answering the survey. So it's probably an unstable number, but however it is they're collecting it, they're sort of collinear, they're sort of flat. I find that surprising, but let's accept it for what it is for the moment. That's what it is. Now this is the counts of the number of incidents. Now you'll notice, I'm sorry, I want to back up one. You'll notice that this is the percentage of firms that have one, and this is how many they have had, and they're still sort of aligned, but now, again, remarkably, it looks like there's less problem inside. My intuition, honestly, by the way, goes the other way. My intuition is the other direction. So I'm not sure what this says, but if I'm looking in an honest sense for sources, this is a source. Does the term open source intelligence mean anything? It means looking at sources of information that are available to everybody. And in such situations, often what you do, since you don't know a lot about how they were collected precisely, is you try to combine multiple sources, or you try to look at the range of multiple sources, what some statisticians would call meta-analysis. You're trying to say, I've got 35 studies of whether red dye number 2 causes problems with kidney sarcoma years later, and you try to combine them together. One might do the same thing here. I'm not going to belabor that. Amongst the FBI respondents, which I probably should be able to spell, the attack rate for insiders and outsiders seems to be falling. Now, this is where they say the number of respondents willing to report their losses this year was less than half the number of the previous year. That probably tells you something. And in fact, I wish they would report the number of total surveys sent and total returned. That would be a great calibrator. If you're the Census Department, for example, this is the kind of stuff you do all day, every day. You worry about this all day, every day, because the Census Department, of course, there's no margin for them failing to count somebody. Some congressman somewhere will beat the daylights out of them for it. They try to catch everybody, and so to a degree, this non-response thing becomes, in effect, a principal focus if you're the Census Department. It should for us as well, in all honesty.